Welcome to First Coat, where we explore public realm art, how it's made, and why it matters. I'm your host, Stephanie Kache, an artist and entrepreneur based in Brooklyn, New York. I run Distill Creative, where I curate and produce site-specific art projects for real estate developers. I focus on creating more equitable and inclusive projects, and I want to get more exposure for the artists and developers doing this work. This week on First Coat, we have Amina Cooper. Amina is a curator, public arts consultant, and public art policy strategist and founder of Amewa Fine Art. She has over a decade of experience working with fine art and public art collections for leading municipalities, museums, and galleries in Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. She currently manages over $3 million in large-scale public art projects as a public art consultant. She is also the inaugural Forecast Change Lab Research Fellow and initiated a broad survey of Black public art. She created and runs the Instagram account Black Monuments. In this episode, we talk about how to create more equity in the public art space and learn from Amina's experience leading large-scale public art projects. Here's our conversation. Welcome to First Coat. Thank you so much for being a guest today. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Amina. I am originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and I am a public art consultant and fine art advisor. And I have my own practice. It's called Amewa Fine Arts. And typically what I do for clients is help them manage the project management piece of coordinating a public art project. But I additionally work with individuals and groups that are interested in either acquiring a collection of either public or fine art, and also to manage that collection once they've established it.
That sounds awesome. It's right up our alley. How would you define art in public space?
That's a great question. And I think that definition is one that has evolved over time. In my view, public art is any expression, any artistic, cultural, creative expression in the public realm, outdoors or in community spaces, that is created either in partnership or in dialogue with community, or with the community or landscape as a consideration. And I think for a long time, we've typically thought of that as bronze sculptures or whatever major stainless steel piece that your city commissioned in the 70s in front of City Hall. But I think the definition has expanded and broadened, thankfully, to include, all types of materials and media, and also work that's not permanent, that's temporary, and works and processes that don't typically yield anything tangible. So it's a really exciting time to be in the field.
In an interview you did with Engaging Local Government Leaders, you talked a lot about growing up near an airport and how that was your first experience of public art. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's so interesting now that I'm, my primary client right now is an airport in Charlotte. My mother retired from Delta Airlines, and I think she started working there the year that I was born and worked there for 20 years. So one of the perks of being, a dependent of somebody that works for an airlines is typically you get to fly for free or at a significantly reduced cost. So, I've been flying for as long as I remember. And I've had the great fortune of being able to travel all across the world. So my earliest memories of public art is going through the old terminals at Hartsfield, and there was this neon work by Stephen Atsanakis. And so as you're going through security, you go down these stairs that take you onto a train that will take you to the terminals. There's these beautiful neon, super 80s style neon artworks, and I just remember them catching my eye. And every time I travel, just looking forward to seeing them, because it was sited at such a location in the airport where you knew if you saw them, you were getting ready to start your journey. So and unfortunately they de-installed those works to make way for advertising, which is just, that's what happens. But that was my earliest memory of public art without really recognizing that it was public art.
How did you first start doing work in public space?
It was interesting, and it was, kind of a struggle to sort of get to this role, which is a role that I've always wanted. I've always wanted to work in the arts, but in a more broadly accessible capacity. I studied fine arts and photography at Howard University and journalism. And I originally thought that I would be this really cool fine art photographer. And then I interned with a commercial photographer, and that just totally killed all of the joy that I had for it. So I said, okay, I need to work on the other end and be an administrator. So I went to Boston University, got an arts management degree, and ended up working after a couple of roles at a local arts agency. And my background in journalism caused me to come into roles managing communications and also doing grant writing. So I fell into this role as a grant writer and a fundraiser. I was working with my organization to try to acquire one of the NEA Our Town grants. And just that process of gathering information, interviewing community, gathering documents, researching, putting together a proposal specifically around a public art project in an underserved, sort of historically neglected part of the state caused me to have more of an understanding of public art. And I think it helped put me on the radar of our CEO. So by the time we got our grant, the former public arts manager transitioned out of the organization, and she was like, is this something that you would want to do? And I was like, absolutely, I've been waiting for you to ask me that. So that's how I came into public art. I started managing the collection that the county had acquired since the 70s. So it's this really broad collection of outdoor sculpture, but also works on paper that had been in the city buildings and county buildings that I was responsible for managing and figuring out the next steps for.
Would you say you do a lot of research based on whatever project you're working on, or do you depend on research that you had as an undergrad? What's the continued learning life like for you?
Honestly, I would say the learning that occurred for me at Howard and at Boston University, particularly around nonprofit management, it's so integral to the work that I do now, because a lot of public art management is understanding budgets, understanding the structures of how businesses and nonprofit enterprises work, understanding city funding, county funding, and basic accounting. And then, my background sort of studying to be this fine artist helped me really work better with artists today, because I understand sort of their concerns, their fears, their capacities. And I feel like I communicate better with artists because I have training as a artist.
What's the role of photography in both preparing a public art project and also in assessing the project?
I don't think so much that I know that I use my photography degree. Generally, it comes into play when I'm evaluating portfolios or I'm thinking about how we want to document work. But it was just really sort of the broad training that I had studying fine arts. And at Howard, I had a photo degree, but I was studying ceramics and silk screening and all of those things. And I think that that's primarily the main thing that helped me work with artists in this role, because it's really being able to work with an artist and then your client group, and then trying to find like a bridge between those two sometimes very different styles of communication, and then hierarchy of needs.
How do you approach curating for art in public space?
Well, for me, the public art, that the word public is just first and foremost. So I try to take a backseat and really think about what the needs of the community are and what the needs of the client are, and figure out how we can meet both of those needs. And then also to address needs and concerns that maybe haven't been articulated or weren't even understood as needs or concerns. Generally, what we, a sort of a best practice for the field is to create either a panel or a group of decision makers and policymakers that represent both sort of artistic expertise, but also are composed of folks that are actually in the community. So when we're looking and evaluating artists, we have the perspective of community members saying, hey, this is what we need. We would love to see this. We're super drawn to that. And then you also have client representation saying, okay, yes, this would work. We can get behind this. And then you're starting that communication and that dialogue that really has to sort of play out throughout the entire process of commissioning, the installation. And then, generally once we've selected an artist based on community input, client input, and then our expertise as the administrators, we still go back to a community-oriented process where hopefully the artist that you selected and we bring on board is able to either have meetings, community meetings, charrettes, however that process looks like for them. And luckily artists are they're just, the brilliance is that they're able to do that in a really new, unique way. So either, sometimes they'll create art with the community and then learn about community interests and communities that way. But The idea and the hope is that they're able to integrate those community voices into the final product without really sort of impinging on what the artist's desires are. And then my role as a public art administrator, as a project manager, is to make sure that the artist has the support that they need, that the community voice is not lost throughout their creative process. And then I also generally like in thinking about curating public space, I like to think about who's not represented and how we can best complement and make comprehensive, that work that is then creating a body of work. You're adding to an existing collection. So I'm thinking, what materials haven't we seen? Which community neighborhoods have not had work cited? So then we might focus on that community. We might focus on a particular culture or community neighborhood that really hasn't had an opportunity to see themselves reflected. So those are the primary considerations. But as you can see, there are a myriad of considerations. But for me, community, the residents, the people that have to live in that space are the primary.
And how do you assess which communities haven't been represented or haven't been seen in the public art or in art in general?
Yeah, a lot of that's where the data and the collection and the research comes in. I had the good fortune really sort of at the start of my career in public art, managing a collection and working with the great consultants that, did assessments of the collection. So in order to say, okay, this is what we should do, you have to really look at the collection as it is and say, okay, this is where we've installed work. This is the period of time in which we've created these works. This is the majority of material that we've used. And then just in the same way that you'll look at sort of funding and you'll see patterns in funding, which communities, which organizations have gotten funding over a period of time. It's the same way with public art. If you have records that you can rely upon. And even if you don't have records, you could just go out into the community and see like, okay, well, we have a lot of works in this urban center, in this downtown area, but these, rural communities, often you'll see deserts. So it's a combination of looking at your records, great collection management practices, but then also just, footwork, just going out into the community and seeing what exists and, where the disparities are.
How do you keep track of all of this? Is there a system that you use? Does it depend on the client?
It depends on the client and agency. I've been able to work at organizations that had collection management systems. So in the same way that you would have a database or, honestly, sometimes it's even just an Excel spreadsheet, unfortunately. Other times it's more robust database systems where you can track when work is created, when it's installed, who the artist is. In the same way that museums have systems that track work, because that's the way that you're able to track maintenance, when maintenance needs will pop up, when a work is due for conservation, because generally that's on a time cycle. So you have to have really robust or just any sort of system to help manage track that, because these works, they're not inexpensive generally, and it's an investment, and you want to be able to take care of your investment over time.
In your blog post, How Public Art Programs Can Join the Movement Against Police Brutality, White Supremacy, and Anti-Black Racism in American Arts, you wrote, "It is time to talk about the lack of diversity within our public art commissions, artist selection panels, and other public artist workforce. We need to address the elitism with which we dictate to communities which artworks are acceptable and which persons and cultures are worth affirming with monuments and beautiful objects." And I'll put that link in the show notes so everybody can actually read the article, because it's a great article. How do you think public art programs, and private funders can better support artists and organizations who are outside of those that have been historically funded?
Yeah. That is a great question. And as, somebody that works in public art, but is also really sort of sees herself as, a policy strategist, I'm continuously asking myself that question and, looking for best practices and answers. So what I can say is that is, something that we have to continue to ask ourselves. I think the benchmark, the very basic thing that we should do that we still have not done is to sort of break up the homogeneousness of our field, because it's difficult to bring in and accept different viewpoints and perspectives when there's, one sort of solid voice in charge of sort of the ecosystem that is our field. So when you look at the field of public art administrators, I believe it's almost 80% white and female. Similarly in art, because it's a marriage between urban designers, urban planners, architects, artists, government policymakers. And there's not enough diversity within those particular fields. So there's just a lack of, one, there's racial bias. There's a lack of understanding of how to even deal with diverse communities in order to integrate them. And there's this sort of a narrowness in terms of what we perceive as excellent, or even our own sort of modes of aesthetic sensibility. It's very narrow. So until we're at the point where at those tables making those decisions and selecting artists, and then selecting which neighborhoods get funding, more like the communities that they're serving, we're not going to get there. So for me, I feel like that is what we need to do, is really just address how to combat issues of racial bias, making sure that our fields and our workforces are more culturally and racially diverse. Once we do that, we'll be able to take on other sort of micro strategies around best ways to engage in community outreach and best ways to support artists. Because right now, those strategies they're not really great. To put it mildly, like we just have so much work to do. And integrating new voices, intergenerational voices, multicultural voices into this field, for me, is a top priority.
How do you influence that when you're working on a project?
Well, one of the things that I've tried to do at the beginning of, we have funding, we want to create art, what should we do? Is making sure that, the artist selection committee, the boards, in a sense, are diverse. So if I'm an administrator on a project, what I'll do is say, okay, listen, and honestly, it'll be like, okay, we have a couple of African Americans from the neighborhood where this work is going to go. We have some Latino voices. We have some LGBTQ voices. We have some, voices that represent Western and European traditions. Do we have a table that looks like our communities? And it's easier to work from there. And if that's something that you can't do as an administrator, another strategy that I've done, partnership with another leader that I worked with, is saying, hey, this board is 100% white. Staff are the only persons of color at this table. So we need to create new policies. And those policies included ensuring that the board was culturally diverse. And that meant that the people who were on that board had to leave. So, sometimes you have to really just you have to write the rules in order, because a lot of the time these organizations and entities are operating under best practices that were created many, many moons ago, many years ago, when the concept of cultural or racial equity was just sort of like this far-flung theory that nobody cared about. A lot of organizations are operating under these policies that haven't really been revisited since the 70s, since the 60s. So that's always a really great place to start for me as somebody that works in policy and strategic planning, is to say, hey, do you have guidelines, do you have policies, and is it time to revisit them?
So taking a look at the foundation of the organization.
Absolutely.
Backwards before you can go forward.
Exactly. Because a lot of the times, the culture and the values are, they come out of these strategic planning documents, these mission statements, these value statements. And until you sort of realign that, you're not going to see those outcomes that, will produce more equitable outcomes for communities.
It seems like there's I don't want to call it a trend, but it does seem a little bit like a trend of organizations trying to be more equitable or being more diverse and having an outside consultant come in and fix everything. How do you think that's been going, or what have you seen just generally with that?
I feel like it's a process that a lot of organizations need to go through. But I think before anything like that can be successful, it takes one strong leadership at the organization, and from the ED or the director to your volunteers to your board of directors. So if there is not a will there, then you need to change your leadership and then recompose your board until that is a value, because you can bring in a consultant all day to create best practices and to create recommendations, but if the will isn't there, and it's generally, or it's just a thing that we were going to say that we do so that we can get this funds, because we know that grantors are funding these initiatives. It's not going to be successful. It's going to be a waste of time.
Mm-hmm. How would you define equity in public art?
That's a great question. For me, I think about my experiences managing collections and seeing these same artists in the records as having executed these works across decades. Equity in public art means that everybody in the community has an opportunity, one, to engage with art in the public realm. So, we're not just creating these pockets where we're only placing public art in white, affluent neighborhoods. It means that every neighborhood gets to have public art in their community. And it also means that artists that are, non-white, that are multi-generational, from different schools, different backgrounds, are able to participate in the process as artists, as community members who get to choose and select art, that everybody is a part of that ecosystem, and that the people who live in those communities get to see themselves and their values and their desires and aspirations reflected in the art community. So for me, that is what equity is, that everybody is, appropriately represented at the table.
Are you an artist? Submit your portfolio at distillcreative.com/artist. You'll get on our Distill directory, our artist database, and be considered for upcoming art commissions. Are there any places, whether that's a city or a town or an organization, that you think are doing this well?
Well, for one, I will say that a lot of times we live with public art and we don't recognize that it's public art. So, I love seeing art in parks, but I also love seeing art in transit. And I guess I'm biased because I've been working with an airport for a while, but I feel like those sort of unlikely places are where you're going to see really cool examples of public art. I love, and I also love sort of this integration of art where people are working and living and playing. I'm born and raised in Atlanta, so I'm biased, but I love the work that they're doing at the Atlanta Beltline, where people can eat and sip and drink and bike ride, and there's artwork that's across all budgets that they can see and enjoy. I love the work that they're doing at LaGuardia Airport. I mean, I just really love beautiful monumental works by diverse artists. But I'm really increasingly interested in sort of this idea of social practice. Mm-hmm. I am a longtime fan of Rick Lowe and the work that they're doing with at Project Row Houses in Houston. I love that model of saying, hey, we're going to build it since nobody wants to fund it. We're going to manage the artwork in our community. We're going to support our community of artists. And, I was recently working in Charlotte, and similarly, sort of like the newer version of that or new iteration of that is a project called Roll Up CLT, managed by really just brilliant public art administrator, Jessica Moss, where she's flipping, sort of rehabbing these underutilized homes, creating spaces where artists can have a fellowship year where they're integrated into the community. They get to learn what the community's issues are. They create projects based on sort of that relationship that they're building with the community over time. So those are just a few of the things that I'm looking at that I really love.
Thank you. I'll put links for all of those in the show notes so people can take a look at those projects and ongoing opportunities to see really great public art. How do you suggest measuring equity in a public art project or program?
Yeah. So that kind of leads me to this really wonderful fellowship opportunity that I've been fortunate to receive through Forecast Public Art in their Change Lab Fellowship. One of the things that I kept hearing, this recurring theme from my colleagues, is that, hey, we want to commission more artists of color, we want to work with more Black artists, but we don't know how to find them. That led me to create this, Instagram page, Black Monuments, where all I do is just post public artworks created by people of African descent. And then that led me to really think about, how do we get more public artworks created by Black artists in particularly? But I also just focused on Black artists, one, because I'm Black, but also I just feel like anything that's going to work for Black people also help serve Latinx, Asian, Indian, Indigenous communities as well. I just think those strategies are just, applicable as well. So my fellowship sort of proposal is really to survey the field of entities that are commissioning art and asking them what their funding structures are. How do they manage their panels, their artist selection panels? How often are they commissioning works by Black artists? And just surveying their existing collection and saying how many of the works collection are actually created by Black people, and asking them for their success stories. Hopefully what I'll find just in this surveying process are trends to say, for example, entities that rely primarily on funding from foundations rather than individuals see more success in commissioning artists of color. For example, I'm trying to tie these outcomes to specific policy decisions that are tied to the overall management of public art programs. So I'm relying on that sort of, hard data. But I also, in the process of this fellowship, is I wanted to do one-on-one interviews with artists, Black artists, just ask them about their experiences to see, how we can improve our relationships with artists, Black artists of color, from the standpoint of, a policymaker. Because often, we're just so happy to get these opportunities that we will put up with a lot of things that we shouldn't put up with. I really want to get those both perspectives, the perspectives of the funder and the commissioner, and the perspective of the artist that has to navigate these policies in order to create these works. Hopefully, by combining those different types of data, I'll be able to see some trends and create best practices for the field that we can use.
How much of the class status of the artist are you tracking?
That's a great question. I have not tracked that in the survey that I've done, but anecdotally, what I see, and I kind of feel like this is an issue that we have more on the side of the administrator, is that we have these perceptions that the projects that we receive that have these big ticket budgets assigned to them feel that you have to have a master's or a terminal degree in the arts in order to execute those projects at that level. And the perception, even if you'll see artists that are non-white come to the table with advanced degrees, the perception is that you still can execute at that level. So then you're not getting those commissions, and then because you don't have commissions, you can't say these are my past projects. So that's another issue that we have. And when we talk about sort of broadening our perspective, our sense of aesthetic, it's also attacking that bias that only white males with masters or MFAs or degrees in architecture are able to manage a project with a six-figure budget. And sometimes I think what we'll see also when arts organizations are attempting to create equitable strategies and bring in artists of color into this public art process, they'll create these programs that will, relegate these very tiny budgets, these $1,000, $50,000 budgets for murals or things like that, for artists of color. And I don't think that that's helpful either.
Yeah, it's something that is very frustrating to me, both as a curator and project manager of public art projects, mostly in the private sector, and also as an artist, that I'll look up an artist that did a really amazing public art project who might be a person of color.
Right.
And always it's like, oh, they got an MFA at Yale or RISD
Right.
or MICA or
Right.
UCLA. Like, it's always that, and it's so frustrating because I'm starting to do more CV research myself just for my own art career. But when I'm looking for artists, there's that, how do you widen the net of who you're going to suggest for a project or look at for inspiration for things or for budgets and things like that, if we continue to pick people who come out of the same pedigree of art institutions. And on the flip side, how do you convince someone to trust somebody with a really large budget if they've never done anything like that before? And so there's just such a gap between the $2 to $50K murals and the $1 million budgets that are being done by the same people who may be people of color, but obviously it's like a very small fraction of people at that level who are people of color, but they still, I think, come from the same background of, this
super schools and these blue chip programs. I tend to think, and this is sort of a conversation that we've been having, is that if an artist doesn't have experience but has an amazing concept has demonstrated the capacity to complete a project at a high level, give them the opportunity, because as a project manager, my role is to support them. My role is to help them. And I feel like we have to sort of just expand the way that we think about what our role is. It's not just managing budgets, it's providing support of all kinds to artists so that they can execute these projects. So whether that looks like pairing them with a fabricator, helping them obtain insurance, which I've done, or helping them partner with a more experienced artist, I think that those are great strategies. I've also seen examples where written into the actual contract is a stipulation where you have to work with a local artist. Mm-hmm. That way, they don't come out of these programs, they have the opportunity to put that project that they've worked on with a more experienced artist on their resume. Mm-hmm. I just think that we have to be more creative and really broaden the idea of what our role is as public art administrators, as people, working in support in the arts, and really helping provide capacity building and training support to artists so that we do see more diversity in the field. But also understanding, that one of the things that I tell people when they're like, oh, we'd love to find an African American for this project, there are great programs and that we are in. And sometimes even when we come out of those programs, we still don't get the opportunity. So, I don't want to, there's also just to be this sort of misconception that you're not going to see non-white artists or professionals with advanced degrees or coming out of great programs, because you will.
Yeah, that's kind of why I asked the class question, because I think something you said about like artists showing that they've completed a project at a high level, it seems like sometimes that's like having access to funds to be able to do a personal project at a high level, or to do a personal project at all after you get your MFA, and instead of getting sucked back into the daily grind of just trying to pay your bills and working anywhere for money, art related or not, but not being able to put time and effort into some substantial project to be able to show that you can do a project on your own. And then it kind of becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy of not doing art.
Stephanie, that's such a great point. And one of the things, I really hope to address that in my interviews with artists, mm-hmm. is just really understanding what the barriers are that they have had to overcome in order to be successful in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm super curious what everybody says, and I'll probably ask you once it's
yeah, no, I'm so looking forward to getting completed and sharing the results with everybody, because I really do hope that something in there that people can take away to create more equidable outcomes for our field.
What are your thoughts on real estate development and public art?
I don't have great thoughts. And only because I have been on a board that was specific to public art and private development. And I don't want to say that experience is typical for, art and private development. But I will say it seemed to me that the developers were only interested in having their ideas sort of rubber stamped. There's rigorousness in terms of identifying artists, same sort of process to make sure that is done equitably, and that's the same sort of investment in making sure that the project and the artwork is right for the space, but also for the community. And oftentimes I feel like those boards are just sort of rubber stamping whatever it is that developers want to do in order to, there's always a sort of a concession and exchange of amenities, and that's unfair. So I just feel like that's such a clear thing. I think it's to the benefit of any developer to, of course, art is a great way to attract interest into your project and to ensure that there's traffic by your project, but you also want to maintain a relationship with that community that you're building your project in. So investing in local artists, creating a community-based process and selecting that artist, I think will create a better situation for the project. But sometimes what I've seen is a developer who is an owner who's wealthy that says, oh, I collect this artist, I want this artist to be on the front of this building, or oh, my golf buddy knows this artist, or oh, I've seen this here, let's put it right here. And it's just, unfortunately, there are not the same constraints that nonprofit or local arts agencies have with commissioning. Oftentimes you're free from those constraints. And sometimes that can be a good thing, to not have to go through sort of a bureaucratic process in order to create work. That way You can say, hey, I want to make sure that there's an African American artist for this project, so we're going to do direct select. Sometimes it can be good, but without sort of that expertise on at the developer end, you're not the other way.
Yeah, I think all of the examples you gave are unfortunately
Right, it sounds familiar,
very
right?
common, and that's part of why I do what I do, because it's just,
Yeah.
it was so frustrating when I was in-house at a real estate developer, and it's just like so random, but it's not random. It's exactly what you said. It's someone they collect and they want to
Right.
keep it in their personal collection, so they're willing to put in that investment for the public piece, or yeah, just they happen to know this random person who makes art, and it's awesome, you know. So
Right.
it's been interesting to try and push the other direction, and also always starting with what is actually going on in this place, like what is already here and who can we actually support and cultivate for. And something that I've seen that's kind of interesting is just like, or what I'd like to get to with my clients, and that I love seeing with other projects in other areas, is you can fund smaller level things and then build up so that those artists in the community are able to take on the larger project, and both sides are more comfortable with it.
Exactly.
But on the flip side, I also totally understand, like, I'm not going to take any money from real estate developers ever. And so I'm a democratic socialist, like I'm like anti-capitalist, and but I also need to make money. So it's just like this weird being stuck in that middle. And I see, to your point, like one of the frustrations I've had as an artist in applying for things is that you have to live in a place for a certain amount of time. You have to have a statement of proof of living there. What if you're not on a lease? Like there have been plenty of times where I don't have anything that shows that I live somewhere, or I haven't lived there long enough, or I don't meet these they're not random, but they're credentials that have been passed down that I think sometimes we're intentionally trying to keep certain people out of being able to make art in the area. So when private funders are willing to just put up the money and they don't really care how it happens, if somebody can go in and make it happen in a more equitable way, I think that's good. It's just, I agree with you, we need to have more policies that actually make sure that people are doing that.
Yeah, and I understand it because, bringing the art on site, that's the fun thing. Like if I'm a real estate developer, that's the one thing that I do want to have my hand in, right? But I just feel like you always need to have experts at the table and a great art advisor or just a community member being a part of those conversations and those decisions is really helpful. Because the other thing too is that the public is not going to make the distinction between this is art and private property, and this is art for the public. They're just going to see art outdoors and assume that maybe either the city or the county, managed that process when they didn't. So I just feel like it's always best to, you always want to meet your own organizational client goals, but if it's work that has to interface with the public, whether or not they're your customer or not, it's considerate, it's the appropriate and smart thing to do. Make sure that it's a cohesive part of a broader landscape.
Definitely. Are you a real estate developer looking for a unique amenity for your site? Get our free guide, 10 tips for commissioning a site-specific artwork, at our website, distillcreative.com. How did you start Aminas Fine Art?
When I came out of grad school, I finally landed on like what I wanted to do professionally, and that was manage art collections for businesses, for individuals, for corporations. And so my end goal, like I just felt like the last thing that I would do after working for other people was to create my own business, my own practice. So even when I was employed by other people, I was still sort of setting the stage for that, so I started an LLC. I gave it a name. And, there's this book by, I believe it's Robert Ferris Thompson, and it's called Flash of the Spirit. And he's talking about the African traditions in contemporary African-American art. And that term is an artistic term that has a relationship to Black aesthetics. So that's why I selected that name. Because even in my professional work, I always want to consider Black artists or aesthetics that are non-Western, non-traditional, because I feel like that is how you're going to get a great collection, is considering multicultural voices. So anyway, started an LLC, didn't expect really to have to activate it at all. if I got opportunities to write, if I got, sort of honorariums, I just thought that would be a vehicle to pass it through there. And then with COVID, I found myself, sort of self-employed and having these increasing opportunities to work on my own. And it's really been wonderful. So I've been able to continue to do project management for Silty Airport just through my own business. And I write my fellowship and other opportunities working with individual clients. I helped a good friend of mine acquire some work and frame it, which is just such a delight. So I'm able to do all of that through my business now. So I'm just hoping to just get more opportunities to do strategic planning, more project management opportunities, and also sort of work with individual public artists just to share sort of what I know in terms of, if you wanted to commission, this is the way to do it. If you're trying to do a project, this is how you should do it. And I don't necessarily want to do that as a part of my practice, but I want to work with more artists that are interested in breaking into this field and just, provide them with best practices and ideas and support, even if it's just a phone call. I'm really, really happy with the way things are going.
That sounds great. It's amazing that you've just kind of, you've been doing this work for a long time, but to be able to launch and do it on your own terms as your own business is really awesome. So,
yeah, and I hope that it's helpful. I just feel like, our field, we just need more expertise that's not tied to an organization, that's free to just work with different clients and share best practices. And that, that has, a different perspective, as an African-American woman that has worked in public art, sort of rarefied air. There are a few of us across the country in this space, and there's not enough work for all of us. There's a lot of opportunities, and I just feel like it's great work to be doing and a great service that we provide to our clients.
How do you work with artists currently?
Yeah, well, so I work with artists as a project manager. So essentially what I do is when we bring an artist on board to create work and they're under contract, and even before they're under contract, I'm helping to make sure that the process that brings them on board is equitable. I make sure that they have the things that they need. And then when they're under contract, I'm managing, I review their budgets. I give them the autonomy to create their own budgets, but I just make sure that that's on track and that there's enough contingency. Manage the communication between the artist and the client and the commissioning body, but also the contractor, the engineers, the construction team, the contractor team, subcontractors. Make sure that the artist has all the information that they need in order to do work that is going to be appropriate for the site. Successful site. So nothing fails, nothing, everything, all the engineering, all the sketches, all the designs are approved. And then taking all of those steps from the concept to their schematic design, their final design, their final drawings, all of that is approved and routed through the right people, through the clients and the people that are ultimately the funders or whatever the commissioning body is, providing all of that information from the artist to the very sort of disparate teams, and make sure all of the approvals are done and are successful, and that the artist has what they need to be able to move into fabrication and ultimately installation. And doing that, particularly for an airport, that will include a lot of security clearances and badges and things like that. So it complicates things, but it makes it just so much more exciting to just be able to work in a dynamic space like that.
It's fun. I think those parts of things are fun, even though it's like a lot of problem solving.
A lot of fire putting, outing, and a lot of you have to really just speak different languages. You have to be able to talk to the artist and talk to the guys with the construction hats on. It's, sometimes it's like night and day.
Yeah, I'm always kind of surprised by how rare it is for someone to have those two skills, because it's something that I know people who I talk to do or who I work with often do. Obviously you do, and but then when I talk to artists, sometimes they're like, "Oh my gosh, thank goodness you were there for this thing," and it's like, what? It was just you just have to deal with lots of different personalities and backgrounds. But then on the flip side, it's knowing okay, this person is probably going to react this way, or this person doesn't have any idea what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
So I can't just be blah, 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 and then expect them to, or clearly this person, because of the bureaucracy of the site, is not aware of what's going on. So you have to explain everything. But
it's a challenge, but it's such a fun challenge. It really is. And I think, keeping in mind that everybody has the same goal of just making something successful and making the landscape, the site, whatever, look good. The artist wants to look good. The architect wants to look good. Everybody has the same goal. They just might speak different language and have different ideas, but getting people on that same page is really, it's fulfilling.
And you probably get to make a lot of people's days happy when it's done, when you see like the end goal. And, you know, even if it's someone who just walked by that day, especially if it's at somewhere where like an airport where there's so many people going by.
It's so funny. You know, a lot of the projects that I'm working on are like 5 years in the making. Mm-hmm. So I get a lot less of those moments and more of the headache moments or the moments, you know, because it takes long-term planning to get this done. So the gratification is so much delayed. If you're into instant gratification, this is not the space for you. But yeah. It is really nice when you start to see stuff come out of the shop, see it being fabricated, and when it's installed and dedicated, it's amazing.
Yeah, I want to go see some of the projects that you've worked on once they're completed.
Oh, yeah, give it another couple of years.
Yeah.
Another couple of years. There's so many projects and I'm like, okay, well in 2024, people are going to be really excited.
Yeah. It is an interesting thing where, you know, especially with social media, it's like, what do you share if it's a spreadsheet that you've been working on for a long time, or just, right. You know, it's so much of it is not tangible, which kind of goes back to also public art that isn't actually tangible as well, is another example of that, I guess. I have so many more questions, but I'm so happy with being able to talk to you and ask.
Yes, it's so great to speak with you too, Stephanie. I really appreciate this conversation and thank you for your time and just your asking the right questions and just, you know, any opportunity to talk about this work I love. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest. And I think people are really going to enjoy hearing from your perspective because we haven't actually had a lot of art administrators besides when I talk about what I'm doing. And I think it's super important to know, like, there are really great people doing this work.
But we're so behind the scenes, you never know. And that's great. You know, I always want the artist and the client, like, this is your thing. I just help facilitate it, and this isn't my project.
How can our listeners find you online?
So my website is amewafineart.com, AMEWA fineart.com. And on Instagram, you can find me at Black Monument on Instagram. And if you're interested in discovering works by African-American designers and architects in public spaces, make sure you follow that page.
Thank you so much for everything you're working on. And thank you again for being a guest. And I'll be following you on the internet.
Awesome. It's so nice to meet you, Stephanie. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for watching this episode of First Coat. If you liked this video, please subscribe and check out the next episode in our playlist. Let me know what else you want to learn about public realm art in the comments below. And follow us on Instagram at First Coat Podcast or at Distill Creative. First Coat is a production of my company, Distill Creative. Check us out at distillcreative.com.